Hi everyone, it's me again. I wanted to talk to you all today about teaching, specifically about private teaching. I don't have any experience at all with classroom teaching. I've done some group lessons, but in terms of public school K through 12, orchestra teacher, all that stuff, I don't have any experience with that. So I'm going to be talking specifically about private teaching. Now, I'll also assume, for the sake of argument, that if you're watching this blog, you're not an already established professional teacher at a major university or anything like that. The things that I'm about to say are not meant to be, this is the kind of teaching you should expect, or these are the only ways to teach. These are just the things that I've found to be effective for me at my level, which is where I suppose some of you at least will want to be in a few years, if you're not already close to being there already. So, about teaching. I think the biggest thing about teaching that surprised me when I first started teaching privately 5 years ago was that the biggest struggle wasn't in learning how to teach the material. It wasn't in learning how to teach vibrato or a particular kind of a bow stroke or intonation. It was in teaching the individual student, teaching the individual person. You'll find when you start teaching that if you have a studio of, say, 10 people, it's less like having a single job where you're working with 10 individuals and more like having 10 different jobs, because of course your different students will have different needs, and I'm not just talking about where they are in the instrument, I'm talking about where they are as people as well. And in order to meet those needs, it's important to put some serious thought into how to connect with people, especially the young ones, because for string players especially, that's where the real cash cow is with the very young ones, because everyone wants their small child to pick up a violin or sometimes a cello. Every once in a while you'll come across an oddball who wants to play the viola. Personally, my recommendation is that if I get a parent and a small child, say 4 or 5 years old, and they come to me and they say, I want to play the viola, my recommendation is going to be to not start them on the viola, but to start them on the violin instead, because the sound problems that are created when you shrink a violin down to, say, a quarter size or an eighth or a half size, those are not terrible, huge problems. But because of the already present size difficulties and proportion difficulties inherent with the viola as an instrument, when you shrink a viola down to, say, this size or this size, the sound quality, just generally speaking, is terrible. Of course, it depends on who your local dealer is. It's important to establish a relationship with the local instrument dealer so that you can have a place to send your students. You know, when a student comes in and says, I want to play the violin, and you ask them, do you have a violin? And they say, no, I have no idea where to get one. It's your responsibility to steer them towards someone trustworthy and worthwhile. So of course, you know, different dealers will have different approaches, and maybe there are dealers out there who have decent sounding half-size violas, but I just haven't found that to be the case by and large. So I'll start my very young viola students out on the violin instead and promise them that they'll switch to the viola by the time they're maybe 7 or 8, roughly. So back to knowing the students. I've found that there were 2 terrific book resources that aided me when I was learning how to work with people. The first was a book called They're Never Too Young and Rarely Too Old to Twinkle. No, it was the other way around. They're Never Too Old and Rarely Too Young to Twinkle by Mary Kay Sloan. It's just a terrific book that has lots of insights about how to connect with your students. And the other one is called Nurtured by Love. It's a standard for any Suzuki teacher. If you go and take a Suzuki certification course, you're going to be required to read this book, and with good reason. It's a good book. Now, both of these books are Suzuki-inspired books, and I want to take a moment to discuss the pros and cons of choosing a particular teaching methodology or school. I think there are, of course, many different opinions about the effectiveness of one school of teaching over another. I think that the most important thing when you're trying to pick a teaching style and a school of teaching through which to guide your students, the most important thing to remember is that the most important thing in any given learning environment is you, the teacher. It's not the methodology. The methodology helps, of course, but of course, if you have a bad teacher, then of course you're going to have students who are saying, oh, I just don't like that method because I had a bad experience. Well, if the teacher was ineffective, or if the teacher had different things in mind than the student did, then yeah, of course there was going to be a bad experience there. Most important thing when you're choosing a methodology is to not apply the method to the student, is to not say, okay, I have this set of teaching books and teaching principles, and I'm going to put them on the child and instruct the child to learn through the method. Rather, it's much more helpful if you look at the student and assess the student's individual needs and then apply the student to the method, because methods are pathways, if you will, and not every student is going to need to walk the same path. With that said, I do recommend all of my personal students to go through the Suzuki method because I find it to be an excellent teaching tool in terms of learning the skills required to express oneself on the violin, but I also augment with other teaching methods as well. And of course, since all of my students are individuals, bringing them through that pathway, the Suzuki pathway, if you bring the student through a particular method or pathway with an open mind, then you'll allow that student to take the things that they need from that pathway without encumbering them with all sorts of extra stuff that they don't really need. Now, as long as we're on the Suzuki method, I want to take a moment to discuss how the Suzuki methodology works for a moment, because I think a lot of people view it with skepticism, because because people don't learn how to read with Suzuki, people like to say, and that it turns out machines rather than people who are expressive. And I don't think that either of those things are necessarily true, but the thing that I want to address more than anything else is that old Suzuki adage that every child can. This is the core of this is the core of the Suzuki philosophy, which is that every child can. If you give that child the opportunity to learn, they will learn. And a lot of people say, well, that suggests that everyone is special, and if everyone is special, no one is special. Well, that's not necessarily true. I think that I personally would slightly modify that Suzuki adage, or rather, I would add an appendage to it. I would say every child can, but not every child will as quickly as each other. This way, if you enter teaching with this mindset that every child will learn, but not necessarily at the same speed, you allow for the expectation that children will learn, or that your students will learn, whether they're children or whether they're adults. You allow for the expectation that your students will learn and that they will do well, while simultaneously not putting undue pressure on them to do things that maybe they don't want to. One of the biggest mistakes that you as a teacher can make is to take your own expectations and put them on the student. I was told a story by a friend recently who said that she played the violin when she was younger, and the teacher came to the parents and said she should be practicing more, she can be doing so much more in the instrument. And the child said, well, my friend who was a child at the time, the child said, no, I'm happy where I am. I have these other things in my life that I'd like to focus on. And the parents backed her up on that, and my friend says that the teacher just never treated her the same again, never really thought of her as being a remarkable student, and the quality of her lessons suffered because of it. You never want to do that. You never ever want to be that teacher who says, in order to do X, you have to put in so many hours of practice time, and then require the student to meet you where you are. Remember, the students and their families are coming to you because they'd like to get something from you. And what they want may not necessarily be the exact thing that you wish you could offer them. You're a provider of services as a teacher, and it's important to try to match your services up with the desires of your students. One of my personal teaching staples is the idea that I require all my students to set their own goals. And that came into use, that was really useful recently when I had a student who, she just wasn't practicing. She wasn't doing the practicing that she needed to. But because I had made her set her own goals, now that we're at the end of the year, rather than sitting her down and saying, you need to practice more and just rah, doing all that, now I have something back from the beginning of the year to point to and say, hey, you said you wanted to do this, you set this goal, and it didn't happen. Let's talk about why this didn't happen, and let's see if we can maximize what you're getting out of the instrument. And that's a very different conversation than just having a generic, you're not practicing enough conversation. This is a conversation that challenges the student rather than tells the student that they're not doing enough. So in closing, the last thing I'd like to say about teaching is that it is so important that you believe in your students. And I know that this might seem like an elementary thing to say, but I see lots of teachers, honestly, who, as they're talking about some of their students, they're talking about the things that their students will never do. And it's sad to hear these teachers talking about their students in ways that limit them. Now, of course, if we accept the ideology that every student can and every student will at their own rate, of course not everyone will achieve the same things, whether that's because of different life goals, different paths that their lives are leading them down, or whether that's because they just have other things on their mind. Whatever the reason is, it's safe to assume that not every child will achieve the same thing because every child is on their own individual path. But if you as a teacher are saying, my student will never do this, then you're giving up on the student. And that's not fair to the student. I actually had a student, I have had a student for the last 2 years or so, who for the first year or so, I want to say, she never showed any kind of talent for tuning the instrument. She never showed any kind of an ear. She never showed any reflection of an idea that she knew whether she was in tune or not. You know, she roughly put her fingers where they were supposed to be, but it just wasn't there. She just wasn't hearing. And while keeping my mind open, I did say to myself, okay, well maybe this is something that I don't want to push her on. I'll focus on other areas of her teaching instead. Well, I found, as we focused on other things, and as we're slowly coming back around to intonation, rather than saying you're going to play in tune and then going about and doing it, I found that putting small to-do lists in front of her has slowly improved her ability to be in tune. Both from a mechanical perspective, she's learned the spacing of the fingers on the fingerboard, which has helped immensely with being in tune, but because she knows roughly where to find the note, she's learning where to hear the notes now. So now, contrary to everything that I had initially thought about this student, she's finally learning not only how to play in tune, but also how to hear in tune. Because that door was never closed on her. If I, as her teacher, had said, she's never going to learn how to play in tune, I'm just not even going to bother with that, then she probably wouldn't be here anymore. Now, in terms of her intonation, now I don't say this to build myself up as a teacher. I say this to highlight how our students are really capable of so much, and they're capable of doing so much more than we sometimes give them credit for. If we just do nothing more than hold the door open, even if we never expect that they'll walk through it, sometimes they'll surprise us. So, believing in your students is the single most important part of being a teacher. So, that's that. I think that we've had a nice little chat about teaching. Hope that you've enjoyed yourselves, and I'll see you next time. Take care.